Now we come to a story about the good old Stonehenge. Stonehenge.
What's the
Um,
meaning of Stonehenge?
Stonehenge in Wiltshire, where uh, it's been a fairly uncontroversial statement for a while now, that the blue stones of Stonehenge came from the Preseli Hills in Wales. Recently, I think last year, there was more evidence, more solidly tying those stones to that part of the world. But the larger Sarsen stones, and really, I suppose as it were, the proper bones of Stonehenge, the arches that we look at when
Yeah.
that we imagine when people are, for example, making their Clonehenge submissions, out of cheese or whatever. Those stones.
I love the one that was made of cars.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's cars.
Yeah.
I think one of my favourites. I think there was someone had tried to make. Um, Stonehenge out of bales of hay, for example. But although the thing is, when you use, especially for the long bits on top, when you use like small blocks, you have to have a board supporting it to create the
Oh, that's
arch.
cheating. No,
It
that
is
doesn't count.
cheating. It's
That doesn't
cheating.
count.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe use celery or something. I don't mean celery with straw, but celery is a good, if you want to make a vegetable henge.
Yeah.
Um, and actually, on that note, we should.
Hedgehenge, I like that.
Well, veg henge, yeah, but also we should say that Stonehenge is not a henge as well, isn't it? It's not a henge monument. As much as it's not a ring ditch with land bridges breaking up the ditch around it. So, anyway, this is all highly technical and a little bit niche. But the Sarsen stones, for a long time have been a bit of a mystery in terms of precisely where they came from. And this is a wonderful bit of research that has finally tied them down to a place 15 miles or 25 kilometres north of Stonehenge's location in Wiltshire, near the town of Marlborough. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And
Oh,
as English Heritage's Sue Greeny said, the discovery is a real thrill because it adds some context to. I mean, one of the reasons why I think it's quite interesting is it adds some context to the question of how they get the stones from wherever they came from to the monument. Now we have a location, and we can
exactly.
talk about that if we want to and if we need to. I mean, what do you think of this work?
Right. Well, first, I'd like to say it's one of those collaborative papers, and I think I'm looking at it now. There's one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight authors
Yep.
involved
Hmm.
in the paper. It was published in a magazine called Science Advances in July, at the end of July. It is on open access, as was the previous paper we discussed, the arc of pits around Stonehenge that we talked about in the last watching brief.
Hmm. Hmm.
So full, full credit there for a major piece of work that's been published open access,
Mm.
and again as an example of collaboration between lots of different organisations, including the University of Brighton, Historic England, who Sue Greeny works for,
Hmm.
University of Reading, and others. So it's a top-notch piece of research for a start.
Well,
And you're right.
interestingly, could I just very quickly just add to that, in so much as I think it's been interesting to see how, with public access to the paper itself, there's been lots of public good questions of the research, and also
Yeah,
conversation around the research. This is yet another flagpole to the notion that actually people can handle it. They people can take a bit of in-depth uh, conversation around an archaeological discovery. It doesn't have to be a headline on its own. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
absolutely. And also, just alluding to our previous topic on the changes to planning, how people actually are engaged with this. If archaeologists invite them in
Mm,
by showing, by putting our work on display like this and having the conversation, that's a real positive. And
mm,
goodness knows we're going to need that kind of support going forward. Obviously, the other, I think the wider point, again, I'm not a prehistorian, although it's a fascinating piece of work, coming so soon after the work on these allegedly mysterious pits. It
whole
shows, I
henge,
think, whole henge, as we call it.
whole
Yeah, absolutely.
henge.
Yeah, whole henge. It shows how first of all, how much there is still to be found out about these prehistoric landscapes. And here we're talking about, broadly speaking, the Neolithic into the early Bronze Age.
Hmm.
Um, and but the politically as well, it plays into the current controversy over the A303 upgrade and the Stonehenge tunnel,
Mm.
because it again, it shows how complex these landscapes are, and that perhaps that we damaged them irrevocably at our peril, because we might not always know what we're going to lose.
Mm. This is true.
However, yeah. Um,
Although we'll
and
be returning, I suppose, to that theme in a moment, in another segment
indeed,
this month. Yeah.
of course, of
Um,
course.
but I suppose actually one of so just to lay it out for you, the BBC article does a good job here in a paragraph. The 7 meter tall Sarsens, which weigh about 20 tons each, form all 15 stones of Stonehenge's central horseshoe. The uprights and lintels of the outer circle, as well as the outlying stones. And the fact that now see, the other thing as well that just occurred to me as well is it was last year, wasn't it? Or it was relatively recently when there was some research done on burials around the monument that
Mm.
showed that lots of people there had come from what is now Wales. And the people go, well, of course, because the Preseli Hills and the Blue Stones. Whereas here we have the largest and the more central part of the monument coming
Yeah,
from a mere 15 miles away.
yeah.
And this adds yet more. Well, frankly, this is one of the reasons why I've never done a video on Stonehenge, is because, frankly, the moment you say something about that monument, it's wrong. Like, and I suppose in this
You should
instance,
come on, come on, Bartman. Man up. You've done videos using using the term Anglo-Saxon. What have you got to be afraid of using the word Stonehenge, for goodness sake?
I'm not going to take that bait. But yeah, no, but they're precisely in so much as the moment you say something definitive about, in particular, Stonehenge, because the landscape is so is continuing to be understood, and because that monument in particular exists as part of a landscape of monuments, and also in this instance of resources for the monument stones. Um, those connections that people were rushing to make to Wales for Stonehenge were, I mean, they're still not wrong in that sense. The Preseli Hills and these people were from what is now Wales, but this adds another depth. It adds another question about the people and how people are coming together, and whether we're deciding to resource to these huge blocks of stone from. And it begs I mean, if I was a processualist, I'd be like, well, of course, it's just up the road. Of course, they're gonna use. That's probably why Stonehenge is built where it's built. It's very close to a river, and it's not too far from the stone's origin. So that there are questions here about why, whether or not actually, because you see, this the other thing is. Sorry, I know I'm rambling now, but with the Blue Mound, with the
This is
so
the
the
man.
blue.
This is the man who's afraid to talk about Stonehenge.
No, I'm happy to debate it. To
Right.
discuss it. Uh, but I say definitive statements are hard to come by. But it's interesting that a spiritual element is mapped onto the Welsh element of the monument quite easily, but largely I think due to a sort of a Celtic nostalgia that people seem to have with sort of, I suppose, Celtic spiritualism and maybe Celtic Christianity. There's something that continues into our culture now that kind of
Whatever Celtic means.
precisely.
Yeah.
Um, but interestingly, it would be interesting to see whether or not people make similar spiritualist kind of, or sort of slightly softer cultural declarations about these stones, having come from just up the road and within England. I think this reveals something which I was talking about when we were talking about those Welsh remains, something about how people, even the best archaeologists, seem to map something onto monuments like Stonehenge that's firmly rooted in the modern map of Britain, if you see what I mean. And so this adds for me, a fascinating element. It forces us to really think about about a different world as opposed to England and Wales.
Absolutely, and I think one of the interesting things about this, when you talk about bringing people together, this is a collaboration between geologists, chemists, archaeologists, because the work, the location was identified through chemical analysis, geochemical analysis. Interestingly, actually, again, folklore of archaeology, they were able to work on a stone core that had actually been extracted in the 1960s and had ended up in the United States because somebody had taken it as a souvenir because nobody wanted it at the end of a particular project.
Wow.
And it prevented them having to ask Historic England if they could drill a hole and get another core out of one of the stones, please. Which apparently they were on the verge of doing when this thing turned up.
Right.
But the people have talked about the bluestones having some sort of magical property.
Yeah.
Or
a healing property.
A healing
Yes.
property, indeed, a healing property. But as you say, the Sarsens, that great horseshoe is probably the actual image of Stonehenge that most people have. So it's not as it's not a healing thing. It's just this huge statement of being. And to know that those stones came from 25 kilometers away, having a point A and a point B, in practical engineering terms, it's interesting. Okay, we can now much more appropriately ask the question: how did they get there?
Well,
There's now
we have the undulations.
Exactly,
We know what any water courses they had to traverse.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm sure when people have a chance to apply for new project funding, so there'll be practical projects to try and demonstrate how you'd move a sarsen from point A to point B, as has been done a number of times before at various stages, often with television money involved. So,
are you pitching? Do you want to do a joint pitch?
I'm not a prehistorian.
Oh, that doesn't stop Dan Snow.
I'm not going to
Sorry,
drop my
sorry,
children.
the mask slipped there.
I'm not going to knock somebody who engages with the public as comprehensively as he does,
Oh,
whatever the
he
motivation.
does. He does. He does. Yes. Bless his
Yeah.
cotton socks.
I wish more archaeologists would be as proactive in reaching out to people and making content.
I wish more archaeologists were in more BBC produces Little Black Books, but that's a whole other story.
That's it is a whole other story. That they might end up in the Little Black Books if they were actually more approachable and talked human more.
Oh well,
But
see that I like the way we're now doing this weird kind of black and white movie side note. But actually, in that sense, they may well be more approachable if they didn't have such terrible experiences of interacting with media companies. Often being edited out of context because prehistory is seen as something that you can just play with and form to fit a predetermined narrative for the show that you're making.
if you say
This is a whole conversation.
we're veering into another subject. We need to have a whole other conversation. And yes, media companies can do appalling things, but
They
you need
regularly
to.
do appalling things.
But often that's because too many people get involved without realizing how programs are made and what producers need.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I'm happy. I'm happy with that statement. But nonetheless, it's exciting. It's interesting. It adds a
Yeah,
whole other dimension to Stonehenge, and it's actually I think just to sum up my excitement, I guess in one other way, it's a concrete, if you forgive the slightly lateral pun, way of pointing to the fact that Stonehenge is more than druids, more than the magical element. This is if you're going to think about Stonehenge, you have to think about what it meant to be in Britain, or what is now Britain at that time, and I like that. Because actually, ultimately, one of the first questions I know I asked when I was a kid was, where the heck did those stones come from? I didn't even know about
yeah,
the blue stones. It's the ones in the middle, as you say. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, exciting stuff.
And are we going to talk about our colleagues who said, "Oh no, not Stonehenge again"? And why do the media always do stories about Stonehenge?
Hey, I understand that. I understand the problem. You see, but this is the. Oh, you see, okay, fine. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do that. Um, the problem is I am often one of those voices. Actually, I'm often one of those people who say, "Oh, not again, not more Stonehenge." In this instance, this is genuinely an interesting story about Stonehenge, but often, not only will there be weird, a crackpot theory from some bloke who used to be an engineer who lives in Texas about Stonehenge will make it to the tippy top of the news agenda for history and archaeology in this country
One of the
regularly.
richest men in the world who likes to build his own space rockets.
Well, yeah, precisely. Yeah. Well, yes, we're coming back to that one, aren't we? Um, so not only does Stonehenge have all that extra baggage, but also it's the use of Stonehenge as the yardstick for so many other things. Without first understanding what Stonehenge actually is. So my argument has always been actually most people don't understand what Stonehenge is. They have a whole slurry of ideas ranging from druids to magic to healing to mammoth, to all sorts of weird, aliens. All this other stuff is
Yeah.
folded in there. And so I understand, I get it when, and frankly, I say I'm one of those voices often who goes, "Oh, can't we just talk about another monument for once?" Just what there are hundreds of stone circles in this in England, never mind the entire United Kingdom, and yet Stonehenge gets a disproportionate amount of attention. Now the thing is, and I know what you're about to say in some ways, is that Stonehenge cuts through so much and immediately communicates something at the very least to Joe Public and to your layperson. If you say Stonehenge, people go, "Oh, it's important. It's probably worth looking at, and it's probably for reasons that I don't fully understand, historically valuable." So I get that it's a good slicing hot knife through the pop culture butter, but it just has so much baggage that I don't blame people for getting a little bit frustrated when there are so many other beautiful stone circles that we could be giving our attention to.
And my quick response to that, and I know we need to wind this segment up, but my quick response to this is, um, first of all, going back to what we were discussing a few minutes ago, if archaeologists were better at communicating that diversity and the beauty and the wonder of those other sites, that might help in terms of widening the public's perception of what
Mm,
these sites are and what they are and where they are and how approachable they are and how wonderful they are.
mm,
Um, but the other thing is, I think, and archaeology should just, I'm sorry, just embrace Stonehenge for the way the public sees it. They've
mhm,
any chance of making Stonehenge part of uh, the Stone Circle herd disappeared when Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a little book called The History of the Kings of Britain and said it was built by Merlin. You know, it's. I'm sorry, you cannot put that baggage away. It's there. It's been part of the popular culture since the 1200s,
mhm, mhm,
and add to that, Mr. Stukely,
mhm, mhm,
and you can't undo all that. You have to just embrace it and run with it.
mhm. hmm No, again, I agree. I think that is the reality that we live in. Um, but uh, I mean, for me, it all comes back down to that news story that yeah, it's 5 years ago now, 6 years ago, when um, at summer solstice there was a BBC report, and the reporter thought it was perfectly okay to ask whether or not Satan or the ancient Egyptians or the aliens had built Stonehenge, standing mere meters away from an information kiosk. And being the BBC, they could have called up, as was English Heritage, and someone would have turned up. I mean, I imagine even the most senior archaeologists would have happily bleary-eyed the modern equivalent, the equivalent of
Well, Sue
who
Green
is
did a
now
lot
Sue
of
Green,
TV on this
exactly.
story.
Yes, precisely. The
Yeah.
equivalent of her would have turned up and explained. Well, actually, the latest research says, and this is where we're at, and this is what we're doing.
Mm,
And this happens to archaeology, and in particular happens to Stonehenge in a way that it doesn't really happen in other scientifically led endeavors. Notice I'm choosing my words very carefully there.
mm,
So, for example, in space science, and again, I've made this point before, but I think it bears repeating in this segment. In space science, often you'll have the co-anchors talking about, oh, but there's some new research coming from Mars. I wonder if they found any little green men. And then they'll cut to the science reporter, who in turn will likely be interviewing someone who is a well-known and trusted voice for science outreach, your Brian Coxes of this world,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
he's given the opportunity to say, well, we haven't found little green men yet, but actually, what's really cool is there's this, and this, and while some of that may well go over the audience's head, the exposure is there.
Yeah.
Whereas with Stonehenge, the distraction is so immediate, and the presumption on the day by that journalist, and this continues every year, I've kept an eye on it, the presumption is that nothing new can be said about that monument other than what they vaguely have in the back of their mind from primary school. And I think that's a real shame. As much as I can rant and rave, and as much as I can try and be cynical about the motives of TV producers or news editors. Um,
Mm,
I think the real shame, and this may well, as you say, come down to public archaeological engagement and communication. The real
mm,
problem is that the needle hasn't moved since the 1950s in terms of popular public perception of Stonehenge and what it means. Arguably, the tunnel, which we're going to be returning to in a later segment, the tunnel has brought some of that maybe to the surface in terms of questioning what Stonehenge means to the
mm.
nation. But I think stories like this, a really good, solid story about the Sarsen stones of Stonehenge, absolutely demonstrates that something new has been determined about this monument. And this is a wonderful moment to be talking about it. And so, in that sense, as much as I get frustrated about Stonehenge and its place in the national and the international psyche, this story has to be focused on and has to be discussed. And now we've
And
been
and
rambling
and,
on for
and
20 minutes.
yeah, and I would just say again, if our viewer wants to, they can go and chase up the media coverage on this, which was extensive
Yes.
in across the board, print, TV, social media, and so in that sense, hopefully, it's an example of how good work, appropriately communicated and made available, can cut through. So yeah.
Mm. No, I agree. I agree. Hopefully, I have you. Actually, I feel like someone in those films where they're like just shooting up an office, like a TV wall. Like, look what you made me do. Like, you brought it out. You made me talk about it. But no, I think it was all topical, wasn't it?